So, yeah, this event has come about from a very fortunate clash between a CSEP development event and a TYD development event. So we've merged and got some economies of scale going, and we've got three panelists now. So to introduce our panelists quickly, we have Dr. Sian Lazar, who's from the University of Cambridge at the Anthropology department. We have Professor Cheryl Mckeon from Durham, who is the Geography department, and we've also got Dr. Hazel Gray from the University of Edinburgh, who's from the Centre for African Studies. So, could you join me in welcoming all of our speakers today? Thank you. So I'll get right underway and just quickly introduce Sian, who will be our first speaker today. Sian is an anthropologist and lecturer here at the University of Cambridge, whose interests lie in anthropology of Latin America, and also labour politics. And she has recently been researching trade unions in Argentina. And she also lectures on anthropology and development here in Cambridge. So we're in very good hands here, and we'll just go straight over to you, Sian.
Sorry, just before we begin, could everyone just push in, sit in the empty seats, because we've got some people sitting on the steps here. So thank you. CSEP, so the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, and I'll just introduce our next speaker very quickly. And basically the structure of our panel will be, we're going to have each of the speakers present their own research first, and then we'll have a panel discussion followed by Q&A. So next up we have Professor Cheryl Mckeon, who is from the Department of Geography from Durham University. Her main research interests include ethical consumption in the Global South, the geographies of transformation in South Africa, and the role of post-colonial theory and decolonial politics in shaping responses to global challenges. And she's authored a book called Post-Colonialism and Development recently, as well as she's also the co-editor of Post-Colonial Development. Let's welcome Professor Mckeon.
Thank you, Tim, and also thanks, Tad. Thanks to both of you for the invitation and for your very generous hospitality. Thanks to everyone for coming this evening. First, I want to just say something about my positionality. I am a white professor of geography from the north of England. I teach post-colonialism and development in a self-declared elite university to classes of undergraduates that are at least 80% UK citizens and routinely 90% white. So this might sound a little bit essentialist, but my point is that decoloniality emerges from an entirely different positionality, specifically from those scholars and activists for whom there's nothing former or post about the colonialism that they struggle against and write about. Kuzi Chankwi describes a political economy of knowledge whereby decolonial theory gets circulated in the Western Academy in spaces like this, in a logocentric and nominalist version that fails to deal with the colonialist roots and continuing inequalities in those spaces. And as a researcher with long-standing and ongoing collaborations with colleagues in South Africa, I'm acutely aware that my attempts to destabilise Western-centric epistemologies of progress and development are a very different kind of politics to, for example, the Fees Must Fall campaign by South African students, who are increasingly militant about their exclusion from spaces like this, and the closing down of equality of access to education because of rising fees and quite incredible debt levels. I should also point out that my research in South Africa is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, which, as Patricia Noxolo points out, is underscored by a disturbingly colonialist mindset. If you read the 2015 Department for International Development White Paper, this declares the UK to be driving global development initiatives and tackling with an unabashed focus on national interest development problems around the world. And those national interests are all about security, crisis, emergency, and so on, rather than the structural causes of poverty. So while my concerns with exposing the epistemic violence of the discourses of development is, you know, all about challenging the power to speak for and the power to speak about countries in the global south and peoples in the global south. It's not the same politics as decolonising knowledge, actually in those spaces where people are living under various forms of colonial power. But it is allied with it, and it is allied to that transformative politics. So that's my starting point. I think it's important to say that. Over the past decade or so, a lot of critical development scholars have embraced post-colonial and anti-colonial theory. They've rejected purely economistic approaches to development. They've recognised the potency of social relations of power in transforming the conditions of human existence. And they are attempting much more ethical ways of doing research with people in the global south, rather than simply for or about those people. But speaking to Tim's remit, and he asked me to speak to, development thinking very often does remain Eurocentric. So I just want to ask why that is. Obviously, the idea of development is rooted in Western Enlightenment ideas about progress and modernity. It's normative. In other words, development is seen as desirable, and it's instrumental. It's seen as a means to an end. It's also worth noting that development studies is taught in very particular places. It's taught primarily in the former European colonial powers, and it's taught in many of their former colonies. So there's a geography to development studies. Why is it remaining a Western-centric set of discourses? Well, we've already heard some of this from Sian, in that it reduces problems to statistical measures. So if we look at the first Sustainable Development Goal, that's setting targets, development targets that countries have to sign up to. One of the goals is by 2030, nobody will be living in poverty. It's quite an ambitious goal, isn't it, one would think. Ending extreme poverty by 2030. But my question would be, does the fact that, you know, even if this goal is met and that there will be no one living under $1.25 a day, or the equivalent of $1.25 a day, does that really equate with ending the lived and material and psychological experience of impoverishment? Does a Chinese wage earner, for example, feel better off when their pay has risen by a few dollars a day, but they're watching people around them whose wealth is escalating, and the things that they are able to purchase is unimaginable for those people whose lives have just marginally improved? Do Chinese people feel better off when their lives are being shortened by pollution? Do impoverished people living in Rio feel better off, even though they've got a few more dollars a day in their pocket, when they're living in a city where the waterways and the bays being poisoned by pollution and their fishing resources are declining? So this idea of poverty being measurable, poverty is a lived experience, it's a psychological experience, and simply raising people above a line does not necessarily take away experiences of poverty. The other reason why development remains Eurocentric is that it's built on the naming practices of the West. And Sian started by talking about those labelling vast parts of the world as poor, as underdeveloped, in order to justify certain forms of intervention in those regions. And those naming practices perform what Gayatri Spivak has referred to as epistemic violence. Okay, so the violence that knowledge does, because of what they erase. So what if the discourse was different? Okay, so what if, instead of categorising whole swathes of the world, the majority of the world's population, as poor, development had actually focused on the things that made those countries rich? Okay, the fact that those countries are rich in resources, rich in cultures, rich in connections and diversity, okay, rather than being imagined as more or less developed. Rich in entrepreneurs, was stymied by a lack of infrastructure or technology. What if, instead of focusing on extreme poverty, the discourse was all about the problem that was identified as extreme wealth? Okay, this is a slightly outdated cartoon because it's referring to the Millennium Goals, but actually, as we've just seen, the first Sustainable Development Goal is ending extreme poverty. What if the problem identified was actually extreme wealth? What would international development look like if that was the problem that was being named, and what would development interventions look like? The latest example of naming practices that I've come across through the work that I'm doing on consumption ethics is Anthropocene. Okay, although it's not mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, the Anthropocene, this idea that human beings are having such an impact on the state of the world that it will be observable in the geological record in future years to come, that this is a new geological age and it will be seen in the geological record. That idea is based on, obviously, a growing realisation in the global north that capitalism no longer creates the conditions for life. It can also open possibilities for engaging with different ways of knowing and being in the world, because it's a way of thinking about the world that is more than human. Okay? It's a way of perhaps engaging, for example, with indigenous ontologies, indigenous ideas of how human beings exist in the world that don't separate nature from culture, for example, which is very different to the Western binaries. But as feminist and post-colonial scholars have argued, Anthropocene is also a Western-centric concept, and it risks further epistemic violence because it erases certain things. It erases the fact that capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy are systems that certain people, certain humans created, and that other humans have powerfully resisted, for example. It's species-level thinking. This is about human impact on the planet. But like a lot of development thinking, what that does is it erases the kind of racialized history of extractive colonialism, again, the kinds of things that Sian was talking about, that has given rise to that form of globalism that we're now referring to as Anthropocene. It ignores the existence of human systems that have organised differently. Okay, so those systems that require human beings to think 7 generations ahead, those human systems that require people to be good ancestors, as well as good citizens, okay, that are built on taking no more than what is needed. It glosses over that. It glosses over the fact that most of the environmental destruction is being caused by a very small minority of the world's population, and yet the effects of Anthropocene are going to be felt and are being felt by the people least responsible. It ignores the fact that arguably for millions of people around the world, the current state is nothing new, since colonised peoples have experienced the reality of environmental and social destruction wrought by development since the advent of capitalism. So the idea that this is a new age, actually, for people who've lived under colonialism, there's nothing new about this at all. It perpetuates techno-scientific solutions that are supposed to address those problems, but also in positing those solutions actually fail to address the core drivers of environmental degradation. And it has the potential to enable one of the more uglier features of environmentalism. And this is this idea that in order to save the planet, the poor should be denied the patterns of life and make sacrifices so that the rich can continue to enjoy the fruits of their wealth. So this is where degrowth policies, I think, and degrowth ideas become really important, because it's a counter to this kind of violence that Anthropocene can do. So one of the problems with Western-centric understandings is that in thinking about development, those discourses quite often struggle to move beyond the binaries that are familiar to all of us, developing, developed, first world, third world, rich, poor, and so on. And I would argue this way of thinking is an obstacle to imaginative ways of transforming and reviewing or renewing development thinking from the margins, which is essentially what post-colonial theories attempt to do. How can we think differently about development from those places that have been conceptually positioned on the edges? And this matters because, as we know, the world's poor now are found largely in middle-income countries. They're not found in the poorest countries. The majority of the world's poor are now located in middle-income countries. And as the anthropologists Jean and John Komaroff argue, Euro-America could be thought to be evolving towards Africa because irregular and precarious livelihoods are the norm everywhere. Okay? Europe and America are evolving towards Africa. The idea that developing countries should be evolving along a linear path to the state of the global north is no longer valid. Development in terms of improving human lives is no longer happening in large parts of the global north. And that's why we're seeing a lot of populist outpourings in politics. And in addition, because economic crises in Europe and North America are increasingly framed in the language of structural adjustment, again, the very things that Sian was talking about in Argentina, austerity, a lost decade of growth, informal work, the global south can be thought of as prefiguring the futures of the global north. So this idea that you've got a linear notion of development with the global south racing to catch up with the global north, you can turn that on its head and say that actually the future for northern economies has already been played out in countries in the global south. But despite this, development studies is often blind to the fact that we in the global north may have something to learn from people who for generations have lived with precarious livelihoods. I just want to give an example of this. Why does this happen? Well, quite frankly, in this country, very often it's down to arrogance. Okay, and this is just one example. A few years ago, the UK government commissioned the United Nations, who went to an independent researcher, Raquel Rolnick, to produce a report on the state of housing in the UK. And this was the response. Now you can look at this and say, well, it's typical Daily Mail, but actually the Daily Mail is citing and quoting politicians, the politicians who commissioned this report. And Grant Shapps actually wrote a letter of complaint to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time. And if you read what they're saying, they are questioning the right of someone who comes from Brazil to tell Britain how to fix its housing problem. That's the arrogance that I'm talking about. Development expertise resides in the global north and it is delivered to the global south. How dare these people from the global south come here and tell us how to fix our problems? Incidentally, this is what Raquel Rolnick was recommending, and the bottom two have become government policy. This is not just peculiar to Britain, this arrogance, it permeates development. So if you look at a particular article, an example from Fan and Polman in 2014, doing a critique of the SDGs, and they point out that all these targets for 2030 are not ambitious at all. And they say that what underpins the SDGs is an idea of economic growth. If you look through the SDGs, yes, they're more inclusive of ideas from the global south, but it's underpinned by the notion of economic growth solving all the problems. And what Fan and Polman argue is there are different models out there that are already going to deliver, in terms of this particular aim, eliminating hunger, by 2025, so 5 years before the Sustainable Development Goals. Now these, what is common to all of these, we might have to take Brazil out of this equation because of what's happening there at the moment, but what is common to all of these is that they are not neoliberal models. Okay, they're very different models of economic intervention. And their argument in this paper is that they are on track to deliver one of the elements of the Sustainable Development Goals much quicker than the UN plan. But we don't learn from other countries because of this arrogance. Expertise resides in northern institutions and in northern policies, northern-driven policies. So what needs to change? I would argue that development scholars everywhere need to decolonise their imaginations. New ideas about responsible and progressive planetary futures are emerging in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, that are far removed from the foundational narrative of economic growth equals modernity equals development. Okay, so the ideas that are emerging in other places are a long way removed from that equation. Economic growth equals modernity or progress equals development. Okay, and these ideas are creating new ethical perspectives on nature, life, and the planet that privilege precisely the kinds of knowledges that Western-centric development discourses have erased. And interestingly, I think in the context of declining Western influence, the racist stereotypes that I'm interested in critiquing, that have inflected development discourses, perhaps also become less relevant. Okay, so as Chilean Mbembe rightly observes, we should leave it to Europeans to deal with their own stupidities because we have more urgent tasks and projects to attend to. Europe will have to deal with its own mental illnesses, the first of these being racism. And his point is that African scholars and activists, he's writing from the context of, he's a Cameroonian intellectual writing from the context of South Africa. But his point is that African scholars and activists are making a creative contribution to the world of ideas and praxis that can be of benefit to the world. And he argues that this has implications for all manner of things in an era of ecological crisis. So theories of exchange, theories of democracy that we're all struggling with at the moment in the global north, theories of human rights, the rights of other species. And he argues that if you look at what is happening in Africa, the very future of the planet is being played out in Africa. So why aren't we engaging with the knowledges and the ideas that are coming from those contexts? And of course, similar arguments are being made by scholars in Latin America and in the resurgent economies of Asia. Ananya Roy argues that crisis and uncertainty is pervading the West and it's actually foreclosing the future. And she contrasts that to Asia, where she argues that ambition and aspiration promise a better future. And her point is not that the future is better in Asia, but her point is that the discourses of a prosperous future actually do political and even economic work in those contexts. So the fact that Asia and other countries in the global south generally are asserting themselves as laboratories for future development is what is significant. And Mbembe himself argues that those older senses of time and space, the idea of linear notions of development and progress, that can be traced right back to the Enlightenment in Western thinking and have run through development thought since the end of the Second World War, are being replaced by these newer senses of time and futures that are founded on much more open narrative models. Okay, so the future is not as settled as it was under those kind of modernisation theories. And it remains to be seen, I think, as to whether those models will decouple Western-centric ideas about development from the pursuit of growth and recouple it with, if you like, a post-colonial ethos, some of the ideas that are emerging in places like African countries, that post-colonial ethos of sharing. But I think by engaging with these ideas, development scholars might better understand the possibilities and have a whole range of possibilities that might give us a bit more cause for optimism in the present time. And I think if we don't do that, then development studies development studies in places like this risks becoming provincialised, anachronistic and irrelevant, unless it starts to engage with these new realities and the innovative solutions that are being sought in these diverse and creative spaces in the global south. And I will end with a question, and that is our concern for decolonising in spaces like this and opening spaces like this to the agency and the voices of the formerly colonised. Does that become irrelevant when the debates that shape the world are already happening elsewhere? I'll leave it there.
There's more space on the other side if anyone wants to move. So Thank you, Cheryl, for that. So I'll introduce our final speaker very quickly. And Dr. Hazel Gray is a lecturer in African Studies and Development at the University of Edinburgh. And her research interests include the political economy of development in Africa, industrial policy and industrialization, state-business relations, as well as institutions and economic performance. Yeah, without any further ado.
Okay, hello everyone. It's really exciting to follow on from the first two speakers, because what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes is how colonialism has been conceptualized and used within a very dominant stream of development economics, or new institutional economics. And what I'm going to suggest is that the kind of issues that two previous speakers have raised about the role of imagination, the role of thinking about the future in decolonizing our ideas of development, the limits of this is actually an active process, and two books which you might be familiar with already are part of this process of closing down the space of thinking about alternative futures of progress. So first of all, I just want to ask, who's read this book? It's called Why Nations Fail. Yeah, I imagine quite a few of them. And who has heard of Douglas North? No? Okay, so those of you who've heard of these people or have read these books in your courses so far, bear with me, because I'm going to explain a little bit about what they say and why looking at what they say is important for these questions of decolonizing development more broadly. I mean, these books are part of a school of thought called New Institutional Economics, and their role and influence is... Okay, so I'm going to be talking particularly about how colonialism is conceptualized within new institutional economics, and why it's important to interrogate and unsettle these framings. And this is an important task because this approach is very dominant within many of our development institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, all of the government institutions of development. So, for example, new institutional economics was very key in the framing of the World Development Report in 2011, and again played a big role in the framing of the Governance and Law Report of 2017. Many World Bank economists draw on new institutional economics to frame their understanding of development. And I mean, so where does this come from then, this new institutional economics? Or where does the idea of colonialism come from within this? And obviously within economics, so I am a political economist, so I have a PhD in economics. And economic history has dealt with colonialism, colonial experiences in rich and diverse ways. But the way that colonialism has been integrated within new institutional economics is really a shallow and narrow framing of what that colonial experience involved. Of course, I mean, more broadly within economics, you have a very rich history of dependency theories to draw on. Walter Rodney, a key thinker in colonial impacts. But these are very, very different from the way that colonialism has been framed here. So new institutional economics is an approach to economics which tries to link mainstream ideas of neoclassical economics with an understanding of institutional change over time. So new institutional economics started to be prevalent in thinking about development economics from the 1960s onwards, and associated with somebody called Douglas North. And originally, the idea behind new institutional economics was that human societies have institutions in order to minimize the costs of transactions between individuals. And so societies develop institutions that help transactions, help exchange, and economic development occurs as institutions are created over time that lower the cost of transacting, so there can be more and more transactions. And over time, the scope of this new institutional economics has expanded and expanded to take on more and more social phenomena. So while the initial concern was in political and economic institutions, concepts such as violence, power have over time been integrated into this overall framework. And development itself has been, the problem of development has been conceptualized as a problem of countries adopting what are termed as good institutions. If countries can adopt good institutions, then they will experience better economic performance over time. And these good institutions have become very much part of conventional wisdom on what development is. And it taps into many of the kind of popular aspirations and political struggles around voice, around democracy, but it gives a very, very narrow framing to what a good institution would be. Essentially, good institutions in this framework are private property and certain forms of Western-style multi-party political institutions, rent-free markets, limited interventions of the government in the market, and democracy as a kind of meta-institution which would guarantee the private property rights. So, colonialism, therefore, plays a huge role in new institutional economic exploration of differences between countries in terms of today's levels of income, which intuitively sounds like the right way to go. Clearly, colonialism has had a huge impact on our contemporary world. But the way that this colonial impact is framed is problematic in many ways. So new institutional economics has jumped on the bandwagon of looking at colonialism and argues that if you're looking for the deep determinants of differences in income levels, you have to look at the differences in these colonial experiences in terms of the type of colonialism, because the type of colonialism basically affected whether private property rights were respected in the post-colonial era. So the Acemoglu and Robertson define these two types of institutions, either inclusive institutions, which are these kind of free market institutions and Western democracy type of institutions, or extractive institutions, which are insecure property rights, interventionist states, authoritarian political systems. And they argue that if colonial experiences determine what kind of institutions have today. But so this has been a debate which has occurred within new institutional economics since the early 2000s. And as I said already, hundreds and hundreds of econometric studies have developed from this view that what we need to find out is what are the roots of good institutions, and that good institutions come from some kind of colonial intervention that set up institutions that secured private property, essentially. So that's at the heart of the debates in new institutional economics. Whether it was British colonialism that established more secure private property, whether it was French colonialism, Spanish colonialism, this is what the debates about colonialism are. But of course, as some of you will know if you studied this in development or in your economics courses, a question which occurs within new institutional economics is which comes first? Is it the good institutions that create high incomes, or is it the high incomes that create good institutions? And in a way, this plagued new institutional economics for a long time. There was this concern that they couldn't prove it through econometric modeling because there was always a problem of causality. And I mean, what really propelled Acemoglu and Robinson's approach into the limelight was the fact that they argued that they had found a solution to this problem of indigeneity. And it's one that in a way reflects broader changes within development economics. So development economics has had quite a revival in recent years, and it's been associated with a kind of innovation around empirical techniques, but very shallow types of theorizing about the kinds of things they're actually measuring here. So the theorizing of, say, colonialism itself is really lacking, but suddenly there are many, many different ways of measuring the impacts of colonialism. So what they did, what Acemoglu and Robertson did, is that if they wanted to find out what, whether it was good institutions that caused economic development, they needed to find a measure of those institutions before incomes started to rise. And they're very famous for using the rates of malaria death as an instrument for measuring the quality of institutions. So let me unpack that a bit, because I think it's really important just to put these in simple terms, what they're saying. What they're saying is that where there were high rates of malaria, Europeans didn't settle. Where there were low rates of malaria, Europeans settled. So essentially, where there was white settler colonialism, there was, low malaria led to white settler colonialism, and the white settler colonialism established what they term as good institutions, while where there were lower levels of settlement by European colonialists, colonial institutional systems were based on extraction. So in countries with high levels of white settlement during the colonial period, the settlers themselves set up these kind of inclusive political institutions, respected their own property rights, and this then had the long-term implications for income levels over time. I mean, this is really fascinating here, because what they're doing is wiping out the violence and the expropriation were at the heart of that colonial experience. So what is termed good institutions here was actually a history of extreme violence and extreme expropriation. And the irony of that is, of course, then what they measure as good institutions in the post-colonial era is actually a lack of expropriation. So expropriation in the first place is the cause of good institutions, but then afterwards private property rights need to be protected. Once they're owned by the settlers, then these are defined as good institutions. And I mean, if you look at it, again, a lot of people have taken this as being, it's become really very common to see references to their work without people really peeling back and thinking, what are the implications of what they're saying here? What does it do to our understanding of colonialism when colonialism is framed in these ways? So, so colonialism features very, very strongly in some forms of new institutional economics, but in a very problematic way, in a way that covers up the violence and the expropriation. The racial hierarchies are at the heart of the colonial project. And then our development projects and our the development visions of the development institutions today are based on the logic that's presented here. But then what about other people? So I want to talk about Douglas North's new work, because Douglas North has been the father of new institutional economics. He is no longer alive, but his last work is on the violence and social orders. And his work is also very, very prominent within development economics today. So I thought I would just, again, go back and let's try and see what is it they're actually saying about colonialism. North is a fascinating guy himself. He was a self-proclaimed Marxist in the 1940s and then had a complete transformation into a convicted, die-hard neoclassical economist. But he was credited with having reinvigorated economics by explaining institutions in a neoclassical framework. So his first work was about the economic growth in the United States from 1970. The dates are wrong. His framework of research has expanded dramatically over time. So he started off with this book about the US, where he was looking at transaction costs, price mechanisms of institutional change. Then he moved on to an economic theory of growth in the Western world. And his last book, Violence and Social Orders, is actually a conceptual framework for interpreting recorded human history. Now, that surely is ambitious. So his latest framework, he says, provides a way of understanding the course of human history over the past 10,000 years, and opens new ways of thinking about the pressing problems of political and economic development facing the world today. You see how powerful this school of thought is within contemporary development economics. And he argues that his work is fascinating because in a way, I think new institutional economics reflects the consensus over time. So you can trace how issues have come into the mainstream and been absorbed into this framework over time. So what his most recent work does is talk about the role of violence. So while before he had this, at the heart of the economic models is the methodological individualist, the individual person who is optimizing and who is rational. But he argues in his latest work, which is the work which I showed you was underpinning the World Bank's approaches to development in the last very influential in the last 5 years, is this idea that not only are humans inherently acquisitive, inherently optimizers, inherently rational, they're also inherently violent. So, in fact, he argues there's another reason for institutions, and this is society has basically created institutions to tame humans' innate violence. And so you have to understand the history of human societies and contemporary development in the way that institutions have then adapted to the problem of creating violence between elites. I think I mean, if some of you might be familiar with other people who argue similarly and also problematically, people like Steven Pinker, who basically argue that human history is a process of societies becoming less violent over time, and there's some really interesting critiques of their approach about what is violence, I mean, can we really explain, can we have these kind of very detextualized understandings of violence without a historical or social context? And he argues that violence, the role of institutions in limiting violence is really, really important because violence destroys production. So elites want to minimize violence in society because they want to produce, they want to benefit from the economy. But if they think that they can benefit more from violence, then they will engage in violence and they will suppress other elites to try and generate basically a kind of equilibrium between them where violence doesn't occur. And he says that the human history can be divided into 3 orders, this 10,000 years of human history. There is something called the natural state, and this is what he calls the prehistory, and he just goes over that in a few pages. But then he says basically settled human societies can be divided into 2 categories. There's the limited access orders and the open access orders. But the limited access orders, I mean, it's really important to understand that these orders are not historical orders. It's not referring to a time period here. So limited access orders existed throughout most of human history, but still exist in the world today. So his definition of limited access orders would include, in fact, all the countries in the world today, except OECD countries, essentially. But they also include the Mayan Empire, they also include the Roman Empire, they also include many, many historical societies, but they don't include Britain after 1650, but they include most of humans. And he says that the limited access order has a particular way of resolving the problem of violence. And he says that institutions in the limited access order create restrictions which give extra benefits to elites. So this is, for example, who has a right to set up a business, who has a right to establish a church or a religious institution, who has a right to set up a school. And he says that these kind of restrictions on the market or restrictions on social interactions, create benefits for those people who have the rights to set up those institutions. So in a sense, elites are incentivized to keep order by getting extra benefits from limited, from institutions that restrict free exchange, essentially. And he says that violence can break out within these limited access orders. But he also makes an economic argument about limited access orders. He said in limited access orders, you can't get as much very good economic performance because there are these restrictions. And he contrasts this to an open access order. An open access order is basically the OECD countries today. Very, very few countries that he characterizes open access orders. And basically, this is like he characterizes OECD countries as open, free, huge amounts of competition, belief systems that also support openness and inclusivity, and they produce better economic outcomes over time because everyone is free to exchange as much as they possibly can. So they frame the problem of development as moving from a limited access order to an open access order. And essentially the directionality within this story is around a process by which states control violence. So the states get better at allowing elites more freedoms to accumulate, to produce, and move to institutions that then limit violence. That is the path of development. But, I mean, where then is colonialism in all of this? How does this process, how do they conceptualize this process of moving from a limited access order to an open access order? Well, colonialism plays no part in this whatsoever. Colonialism in this framing plays no part in the creation of the world as it is today. In fact, I always shock myself with this. I mean, this is, a lot of what I'm talking about is based on the paper I wrote in 2016, but it's also in my book, which came out earlier this year, called Turbulence and Order in Economic Development. And I always get shocked because if you look up slavery or you look up colonialism in the index of violence and social orders, it's not there. And this is a book which accounts for 10,000 years of human history and is pivotal to the framing of development today. I mean, it really is extraordinary, and I always have to remind myself, like, oh, maybe I just missed it, let me go and have a look again. But it's not there for a reason, and that's because the turning points for their understanding of what creates a good society have got nothing to do with colonialism, expropriation, well, actual experiences of violence in accumulation that occurred in recent history and continuing. So the period in which Britain transformed itself from being a limited access order to being this flourishing open access order was actually 1750 to 1820, and the dynamics behind this were kind of elite politics within the British Parliament. All of these approaches are very problematic because of the way that they conceptualize violence. So again, the appeal of these works is that they seem to encompass more and more and more of the social phenomena that we would be interested in, but they do so in a way that damages our actual understanding of these processes. So, for example, the role of violence in colonialism is therefore removed both from the Ashimoglu and Robinson framing and from the North framing. The role of violence in accumulation itself as an accumulation strategy. So if you remember that the North frames the limited access order as elites wanting to limit violence because violence is seen to be the antithesis of accumulation. Well, actually, violence actually can be part of a strategy of capitalist war of accumulation itself, and clearly actual histories of colonialism show this. And it also gives us no tools to understand violence within particular social and historical contexts. It also gives us no tools to understand the connections between open access orders and limited access orders, so between the OECD countries and the limited and the rest of the world. You know, the violence wars that occur around the world, do they have nothing to do with what's going on in the open access orders? Are there no links that we can make between violence in different parts of the world? Well, we can't understand it through these framings. But also, and here I need to explain myself, also I argue that all of these approaches actually ignore the economy. So while they are economic, their framing of the economy is all about transactions, actually process of production, distribution, profit-making, profit-seeking by firms, by companies, organizations of these sorts. It's silent on these actual experiences. And I think that's particularly, I mean, it's very damaging for understanding the contemporary world, but it does huge damage and huge epistemic violence to our understanding of colonialism itself, because you know, how colonialism operated, the institutions of extraction in colonialism really aren't covered in these texts on colonial experiences. So, you know, if you take, for example, the banking sector, many people who go through development economics courses will study these texts and have a framing of colonialism based on these texts, and come out of a course not really understanding that, you know, say, take Tanzania, for example, two of the major colonial banks that kept about 90% of their accounts offshore during the colonial period, and were key in terms of the conduit of extraction for British colonialism in Tanzania are the same banks that are back there today, who hold about 60% of their accounts offshore. So without this kind of detailed understanding of how colonialism, the institutions of colonialism, we're actually impoverishing our understanding of the economy of paths of accumulation. And if you take, say, for example, the rise of the Fordist model of industrialization, or systems of shop floor production, a lot of these were actually built on experiences of enslavement, of plantation labor, etc. And all of that is just wiped out of these history. And NIE, so I mean, just to conclude, what the consequences of the dominance of this particular approach to understanding colonial history is it reaffirms the ideal of the free market. So even though mainstream economics is claiming that it's moved beyond the kind of free market dominance of the 80s, actually you find it reaffirms in different ways and subtle ways the idea that actually there shouldn't be restrictions on the market. The state should be very limited. There shouldn't be, and actually if you read the policy suggestions in this book, the kind of things that it says is that teachers mobilizing for higher pay is negative because that's a sign that elites are kind of mobilizing to restrict the access to schooling, etc. So it's a very regressive agenda of economic policy making. But it also is absolutely a critical part of the project of capitalist myth-making about the roots of capitalism. And then it plays this very, very active role in the kind of foreclosing of discussions of the future. So following up from what you've already heard about the need for that discussion, the prevalence of these kind of approaches and the lack of interrogation of these approaches stops the imaginative activities that we need to think beyond capitalism. And they've really played into a framing of development about security and political order, but not about freedom, not about the flourishing of human spirit in all of its different forms. And it really damages a decolonialism project, a decolonizing project, because it stops us understanding colonialism and the construction of capitalist political orders, of which colonialism is central to, that are underpinned by hierarchies of race, of gender and class.
So we're going to move straight on to Q&A right now, and I think I'll start us off with a couple of questions and then we'll move to the floor. So yeah, a lot of us here are students who have come from all around the world to top-notch institutions like these in the global north to learn about development studies. So is this sort of indicative of a self-perpetuating cycle of long-term influence by Western academia in the scope of, I guess, development studies?
Thanks, that's an interesting question. I would say that it depends on what you are bringing into these spaces, because one of the reason why post-colonialism is, and post-colonial theory has had such an impact on how we scrutinise the language of development, discourses of development, is precisely from a process of migration. I know scholars who were primarily located in the Subaltern Studies group in India, coming to the West and encountering precisely the blocks and the epistemic violence that they've gone on to critique. So actually it was through that process of migration and challenging what it was that they found when they came into spaces like this that has actually led to a questioning of Western knowledge. So I think it can be very powerful. Obviously the other side of that is that it then gets institutionalised in quite problematic ways, in that those radical theories, when those scholars, the likes of Edward Said, the likes of Gayatri Spivak, Chakrabarty and so on, then locate themselves in the centre of Western knowledge production, that in some way it takes the radical elements out of those ways of thinking, the radical confrontation, if you like, with Western ways of knowing. So I think it's an interesting question. I think a lot of what is happening around the spread from the global south to the global north, again another counter movement of the whole Roads Must Fall campaign and debates about decolonising curricula. I think that is another example of where there is a very politically progressive movement, because people from other parts of the world are inhabiting and know what it is like to experience inhabiting these spaces. So I think it is still, for me, I'm still very hopeful about it. I still do think of it as having radical potential.
I think that my short answer to you might well be yes, it is. But I think this is kind of the point that I wanted to make at the end. You know, is the answer to that just to sweep everything away, or is the answer to that to do the best we can in the situations that we're in? And exactly as Cheryl said, you know, the sort of migration of ideas is definitely a good thing. It's not going to totally resolve all the inequalities that we've been talking about, but it bit by bit might help. And I think that, you know, life is messy. It doesn't come up with these kind of clear answers to, well, you know, no, I'm going to be completely ethically pure. It's, I think, not possible. So, you know, what we can do from these very privileged spaces is also try and do the best we can to be allies, to also look at what it is that we are doing to perpetuate these things, and actually seriously question what we can do in our own lives and in our own political campaigning within the university and also outside of the university to redress these things insofar as, you know, we're able to. So that means, you know, it's a tough call.
Yeah, we can move to questions from the floor. Yeah, anyone have questions?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. My question would probably be to Cheryl. So I'm a South African and I'm doing my PhD on digital neo-colonialism. One of my specific angles that I look at is decolonizing for who? And one of that in particular is the Fees Must Fall movements that you have mentioned. And the way I look at it is actually the Fees Must Fall movements is only a voice of 5 to 10% of South African youth, and actually the majority of South African youth are left out of this. And so it raises the question, what is decolonization really within the South African context if it doesn't actually deal with the structural inequalities of the country? And I think a few of you raised it in terms of decolonization becoming academic jargon, but not actually addressing social justice. So could you talk to that a bit, please? Thank you.
Yes, there's an interesting paper by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I think that's precisely what I was alluding to in the way that I opened up, that decolonizing knowledge is not the same as decolonizing access to education. And so the other side of that, very briefly, is I think we always have to be mindful. I first started engaging with post-colonial theory by reading Gayatri Spivak, and I think Gayatri Spivak has a useful caution in her writing about who it is that speaks for and about other people. And the people who, you know, her arguments about the subaltern not being able to speak is people are subaltern because, of course, they can speak, but they're not heard. And there is always power involved when groups of people are able to claim a voice. Those people who are speaking are no longer subaltern under Spivak's definition. So the people who are fighting in those spaces in South Africa and in other spaces for access to education are not the subaltern peoples, because it's the subaltern peoples who don't have a voice. And there is always a danger when those people who have access to a voice, who have the power of authorization, authority, authoring, it's the same word, there's a power relation in that, the opportunities to speak for, to speak about, to represent discursively and to represent politically, that is a claim to power. So I think you're right in raising that. There are a lot of people who don't have access to those forums to be able to articulate their own demands. So yeah, it's an interesting political dilemma, and I agree with you that decolonisation involves much more than decolonising knowledge. And that political project is not a political project that I can claim in the position that I am in.
Okay.
So I have a question that I think I struggle a lot with, particularly around decolonising development. And that is that I wonder, because decolonisation has a very strong sort of discursive framework of taking out, removing, sort of undoing. And I wonder where's the space for discussions around redistribution, and where's the space for discussions around doing? Because sometimes it feels like the decolonisation talks allow removal for the so-called West, and sort of this, oh, we're sorry, we made a mistake, it's not our, you know, you do your thing, we'll do ours. But there still needs to be some kind of relationship of redistribution and responsibility. So I'm just wondering, you know, in the development framework, how do we balance that?
Well, this, I think, is my discomfort with the idea of whether you can decolonise development, because if it's specifically about the way that global capitalism accumulates and the logic of accumulation on a global scale, then decolonising development becomes meaningless, because development would no longer exist if you stopped thinking of the economy in those terms. And I mean, I thought it was totally correct, this issue of, well, what if extreme wealth were the problem? You know, what if the logic of capitalist accumulation that relies on this extraction of all sorts of resources, you know, even like to the point of extracting the resources from the lives of future generations, right? I mean, we're just using everything up. And so I completely agree with you, and I think that's why, for me, you know, we need to kind of critique the sort of global relations, and how, but also question within ourselves, what is it we think of when we think of economic betterment or just betterment and better lives, and how do we kind of achieve that within our own spaces of action that we can act in?
Just to add that obviously decolonisation can be attached to many different kinds of political agendas, but we hope that it would be attached, given, you know, if you're engaging with the material structures of colonialism, that it would be an anti-capitalist imaginary and project, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be that. And that's, I mean, it's a fascinating and complex set of ideas, and rewarding, because it opens a space for thinking about what should be the content of political action.
Hi, thank you so much. I guess my question is for all of you. What would you say is the objective of the IMF and World Bank? Because if you're continuing with policies that are essentially proven failure in certain situations, and you still push those policies, is the objective then different from development? Would it be fair to call some of this like a front for continuing the civilizing mission of making the South like the North? What is the objective?
The objective of the IMF, as far as I understand it, Karen Caulfield's written some really good work about the IMF for development. The objective of the IMF is to preserve the global financial system so that you don't have countries that can't pay their debts, actually. And it's quite a kind of logical objective. This is, that's from that kind of interpretation. And then what flows from that is the idea that you need kind of responsible economic policies in order to enable countries to be able to pay back interest payments and debts and those kinds of things. So the objective of the IMF is really about stability of the global financial system, which is constructed by the countries, in the United States and Europe. And I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I don't have an answer to actually think about what the entry of China to this kind of multipolar world, to become this sort of multipolar world, what that effect will be on the IMF. But at the minute, the IMF and the World Bank are kind of European and American run institutions, and that's what the IMF wants to do. The World Bank, I think that changes actually a bit more over time. But I can tell you what its objective is not, and I, in my view, sorry, this is all very personal, but my view is that the World Bank is not about deconstructing the structures of power that keep people in poverty. So, it's, and I think nowadays, actually, a lot of what the World Bank does is make the current capitalist system palatable by giving little projects and bits and pieces so that people don't rise up.
Of course, the World Bank, I mean, we're a long way from the Keynesian underpinnings of the World Bank when it was first formed. Yeah. And as you say, it does change over time. I mean, I would just point to what has happened in Ethiopia in recent years. So in 2014, Deloitte published a report on Ethiopia's new economic miracle. And the GDP had risen by 100%, to doubled in 6 years. 2 years later, a state of emergency was declared in Ethiopia because whilst what was happening was, and again, this was driven by the World Bank, that started producing lots of very nice maps of the new middle classes in Africa. And the new middle classes in Africa are anyone who is living on more than $2 a day. So just above their own poverty line, suddenly, all of a sudden, there are these new middle classes in Africa. What did that coincide with? It coincided with post-2008. It coincided with the slowing down of the Chinese and the Indian economies. So this was all about promoting what was previously a basket case continent as the new terrain for investment. This is where all of those companies in the global north could go and sell their stuff. And not only that, the World Bank produced a whole list of graphs that showed the unproductive or underused fertile land in African countries. What did that trigger? A land grab. So the one thing that Sian didn't talk about in her talk was the land grabbing that has gone on. And so that 2016 state of emergency in Ethiopia was because half the population are living below the poverty line, the World Bank's own poverty line. And 10 million people were in imminent danger of starvation, and that was happening while the Gulf countries and China were rapidly buying up, and speculators from everywhere buying up whole chunks of Ethiopia, forcing indigenous people off the land and growing flowers. So you've got countries from outside of Ethiopia buying up land in Ethiopia to secure their own food futures and their own food security, while potentially millions of people were on the verge of starvation, and that was all precipitated by World Bank narratives, World Bank discourses. So that's where the link with, interrogating those discourses and thinking about what the material effects of those are, I think comes in terms of we need to decolonise those discourses. But yeah, the World Bank was very much about stabilising the global economy, finding new avenues for northern-based or western-based companies to invest in, because there was a threat of a global slowdown, because the ripples of the financial crisis were starting to hit India and China, which are obviously the engines of the global economy. So it's all about, it doesn't matter what's going to happen in Ethiopia, They're not bothered that people are going to starve, but what they will do is they're fueling the little d development, the kind of imminent process of capitalism, and then the World Bank will come up with a whole set of programs, big D development, to deal with the catastrophic consequences of little d development, which is what development has always been. Development, the big D development, the intentional intervention in the affairs of initially industrial countries and then the third world, has always been about sticking plasters to deal with the catastrophic consequences of global capitalism. And that's the business of the World Bank. The economist is going to correct me now.
No, I was going to add a different perspective, because I think that if you ask people at the World Bank, they wouldn't see it in those terms. And the reason for that is because the idea of the economy that underpins these policies, that more liberalisation, more power to foreign firms, is going to benefit everyone, is so deeply entrenched and unproblematized that it's very hard to dislodge and to create cognitive dissonances in those framings. So there is kind of a you can see actually this kind of brutal rationalist benefits to Western companies, but at the same time these people are framing interventions very much because they think that they're doing something right, because it's like to problematize gravity, the kind of challenges of thinking about the economy differently are so great. They're not insurmountable, but it takes a kind of root and branch change because economists have so much power essentially within these institutions, and they use a particular kind of technical training as a badge to have career progress and to have power. The whole system just reinforces that particular worldview. So it defies, it's not just about a kind of rationalization there, it's a kind of the norms that are embedded, which is why the imagination has to play a role in overcoming these kind of power structures.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting books, as some of you may have come across, which are the institutional ethnographies of the World Bank, the Goldman and the Tanya Murray-Lee book. And it's worth looking at those because obviously a lot of people who go to work in the World Bank do have, it's in some cases, very detailed ethnographic knowledge of the places in which these programs are being rolled out. But actually that ethnographic knowledge is lost through rendering it technical and through the programming. And so those institutional ethnographies have talked about the problems with programming in the World Bank and how difficult it is for someone going in with radical new ideas to work within those structures, within the institutions.
I think we have time for one last question.
That's a great question, and I think there is a much older tradition of the study of institutions which does exactly what you described. So it's not that institutions itself necessarily has to exclude their social context, but it has to have a starting point of society and of all the culture, power relations, etc., and not stop the analysis of institutions at the institutional boundaries, but to understand their meanings and their complexities within historicized framing. So I think it's possible to study institutions. I hope it is, because that's what I do. So for example, in my work, looking at the socialist economic institutions that Tanzania and Vietnam adopted in the 1970s, I think we do need to have this kind of fine-grained understanding of institutions, of economic and political institutions. But if we want to understand how institutions work, we can't just look at the institutional mechanisms themselves. We do have to understand power and culture, etc., etc., which is what's so fascinating about it. It's not limited. It has to be an open system of analysis, essentially, that takes on scale and different theories and knows its own limits as well. So, you know, for example, dependency theory offers a different scale of analysis to some of the kind of stories and understandings of process of economic change that we can get by studying domestic institutions, and similarly, you know, at the level of the individual, an anthropological lens, an ethnographic lens provides different kinds of information on economic processes. So an institutional lens can never be everything, but it can be something.
I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to everyone.